In this presentation, we're going to take a look at the Flask Web Application Framework. Flask is based on the WSGI web specification, which stands for Web Server Gateway Interface, and it allows you to write programs that interact with web server communication requests. So you could have a program on a computer listening to HTTP requests, like for instance, to load a web page or to access a web API resource. Flask is only one of many different technologies you can use to accomplish this goal, and another which is very popular is called Django. Flask is at this website, the palletsprojects.com/p/flask. That's the home page, and you can get the latest information about Flask from there. Now, Flask isn't necessarily always installed inside of the Python environment, so you may actually have to run a pip install command to get it to work. If it's not installed, you would open up a terminal. I happen to do it from Visual Studio Code in this case, and I'll type pip install, and then I'll enter Flask. And if it's already installed, you will see these requirement already satisfied messages in your output from that command. Let's take a look at what we're trying to accomplish with our first Flask program. Notice here I have a browser opened up, and in the browser I have this URL bar, and it shows a web address. When I type in this web address, what happens is a DNS request is sent out to see if it can resolve this palletsprojects.com server, and when it's able to find that, it passes this entire request to that server, so it then looks for a P resource and a Flask resource. Now, what is returned from this request is entirely depending on what is programmed on the server. It can be HTML that comes back. It can be HTTP raw data. It can be JSON, the JavaScript object notation format, which would work with Web API. So it can be any number of things. Now notice here they have an example program at the bottom, and there's really no reason why we can't use this for our first demonstration. So if we take a look here, we have to import from the Flask library. We're going to import the Flask class, followed by escape and request. And we can paste that into a code file. To do that, I'm going to add a new folder, and I recommend for every one of your web projects that you create using Flask that they would be self-contained in their own folders. And that's because you're probably going to be using a file called app.py to do most of your work. And I can explain that in more detail as it becomes more pertinent. So let's go ahead and create a hello folder. And inside the hello folder, we'll create a new file and we'll say hello.py. And in hello.py, I can put my from Flask command. And I'm actually going to do a simpler example than the one we saw on the web page, just to show you really quickly how fast it is to put a Flask web server together. Then I'm going to create an app variable. And this app variable is going to allow us to essentially run the web server, because we're creating a new Flask variable and we're going to pass it the name of our module, and we're going to at the end have a name block where we test to see if it's equal to main. So if it's in a multi-threaded environment or for whatever reason, we only want to run this once. Okay? Then we're going to take this app variable, which is a Flask object variable, and we're going to say run on it. That will start the web service. But right now, it's not going to do anything because we don't have any methods in here to accept the requests coming from a web browser. So let's create a method and we'll call it hello. And the method name is actually relatively arbitrary. We could really name this whatever we want. What's going to matter is how we route to this. And I'll explain routing in just a minute. For this method, we're only going to return a hello world string. However, we're still not ready to run this. As I mentioned, we have to be able to route to this method. A route is simply the part of the web address that occurs after the server name. So if we're at python.org, the python.org would be the server name, and then anything after that and a slash would be routing information. It would contain possibly resource directories, identifiers, URL parameters. All of that can happen after the .com or the .org address. So what we're going to do here is tell this method to accept basically a blank string after the whatever it is, abc.com address. Since we're not really hosting this in the internet, we don't have a domain name. When we run this, it's going to be running on our local server and we'll access it as such. And anything after the IP address for this local server and whatever port number is assigned when I run this, that is what's going to map to this route. And again, it's an empty route. It just has a /. So I have to make sure I have a space between lesson and 9 there. And then I'll change into the hello folder. And you'll see I have the hello.py Python file. When I type in python hello.py, you'll see here it starts the Flask app, and then it tells us it's running at http://127.0.0.1:5000. Now, this web address is not really the IP address of my computer. This is known as the loopback IP address. And when you have testing and you don't know what the IP address is of your local machine, a lot of times you can use localhost to resolve the local machine's IP address, or this loopback adapter, which is 127.0.0.1. And that will just basically point it right back to this machine. And notice it says you can click it because it's control click because it's highlighting it here as a link, or I can bring up my web browser again and I can type it in directly here. And let's go ahead. Let's type in the address. And you'll see it says hello world. Now, it's not very pretty. As a matter of fact, you can't even see that there's a space between hello and world because I gave it a raw text string and it's interpreting it as HTML here. So if I wanted to make sure that there was a space between it, that's when I'd have to start getting into putting in some actual HTML in there. Now notice here if I hit Control F5, it does not update it because right now the web server hasn't restarted. So I have to kill the web server and restart it. There are switches you can use to restart the web server automatically whenever you change one of the source files. But I always found that there's some caching issues that may go along with that. So it's best to probably just close it down by doing the Control-C and then restarting the app altogether. And you'll also notice that every time I make a request, it puts the requests right here in the debug output, and you can see that it was a request made to 127.0.0.1, what the request was. It was a GET request using HTTP version 1.1, and it returned a result code of 200. In HTTP, 200 is a good code. That means it was able to find the resource and it returned the resource. One of the codes you may be familiar with is when it can't find it, you'll get a 404. So let me close this down, restart it, and then I'll refresh. And now you'll see there is a space in between hello and world. Okay, so we injected some raw HTML into the return string by using that ampersand NBSP, which stands for non-breaking space. But when we start to use more sophisticated techniques for outputting HTML, we don't have to worry about hard coding it like this inside of our Python file. We will actually use real HTML files as templates and return that file, possibly with substitutions inside of it. What happens if I ask for something else in here like ABC? Now I have a not found, and you can see the ABC route was not found, so it returned a 404 right here in the status message. 404 again is resource not found. And if you want, you can look up the HTTP result codes or response codes. You can see the successful ones are in the 200s. And you can get a list of all of them. And if I scroll down to 404, you'll see it's the not found, the dreaded not found message. Also notice if I look back in the output, there's this red warning message that says, this is a development server, do not use it in a production deployment. This Flask setup that we're using right here is basically for testing locally on your dev box. There's a lot to security and authentication that we're just not going to have time to get to in these demos because it's a fairly advanced topic. So when you want to deploy to a real web server, there are some steps you have to go through to make this work properly and in a secure manner. So that is something, if you are interested in, there are classes dedicated just to this technology, whether it be Flask or Django or one of the other web frameworks.